There are stories you hear, and then there are stories that find you. This one, it found me. It crept into my life like a shadow, a whisper on the wind, a secret buried so deep you'd think it was part of the earth itself. It started, as so many strange things do, with a seemingly ordinary man and a mark on his skin, a mark that was a key to a past he never knew existed. His name was Elijah, and he was the kind of guy who faded into the background. 35 years old, lived in a small apartment in Salt Lake City, a graphic designer with a fondness for old jazz records and a habit of biting his lip when he was thinking. He was a puzzle of a man, a solitary figure with a life so quiet it was almost deafening. But there was one thing about him that wasn't quiet at all. On his left forearm, just below the elbow, was a tattoo. It wasn't a dragon or a skull or some elaborate piece of art. It was a single stylized bird, a raven, its wings outstretched as if caught in a silent scream. It was a beautiful, dark, and unsettling tattoo, and it was a mystery. You see, Elijah hadn't gotten the tattoo himself. He had been born with it. He was a foundling, left on the steps of a fire station one cold November night, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The only thing they found with him was a small, tarnished silver locket with no picture inside. The mark on his arm, the strange bird, a small, indelible brand on his skin. The doctors said it was a birthmark, but it wasn't. It was ink, a deep, black pigment that pulsed with a life of its own beneath his skin. No one could explain it. The adoption agency, the police, the doctors, they all shrugged, called it a medical anomaly, a freak of nature, and moved on. But for Elijah, it was an anchor, a constant reminder of the mother who abandoned him, a ghost he had never met. He tried to ignore it. He wore long-sleeved shirts, even in the blistering summer heat. He'd catch glimpses of it in the mirror, and a cold dread would coil in his stomach. The bird was always there, a permanent stain, a haunting question. Who was she? Why did she leave me? And what does this bird mean? His adoptive parents, wonderful people, had given him a loving home, a good life. They never treated him as anything less than their own. But the questions, they were always there, a low hum beneath the surface of his quiet life. He felt like a book with the first chapter missing, an incomplete story. The years passed. He grew up, went to college, got his job. He tried to be happy, to be normal, to forget the raven on his arm. But the whispers grew louder. It started with a series of strange coincidences. He'd be walking down the street, and a woman with an identical scar on her wrist would pass by, her eyes meeting his for a split second before she vanished into the crowd. He'd see a fleeting reflection of the bird on a stranger's car window, a trick of the light that made his heart pound. These were just tricks of the mind, right? Just a man obsessed with a mark on his skin? But then one day it wasn't a trick. He was at a coffee shop, sketching in his notebook, when a woman with a fiery mane of red hair sat down at the table across from him. She was loud, boisterous, her laughter echoing through the quiet space. He tried to ignore her, to focus on his work, but his eyes were drawn to her hand as she reached for her mug. On her wrist, a tiny, almost invisible tattoo of a single black feather. It wasn't the raven, not exactly, but it was too close to be a coincidence. The same stark black ink, the same stylized lines. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He felt the blood rush from his face. She saw him staring, and her laugh faltered. The look in her eyes, it was a mix of recognition and raw fear. She got up abruptly, leaving her coffee, and practically ran out of the shop. Elijah was left there, his hand trembling, the image of the feather seared into his mind. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. The bird on his arm, the feather on her wrist. They were pieces of the same puzzle, two halves of a terrible secret. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life was about to change forever. The quiet man was about to follow a trail of ink, and what he would find at the end was more terrifying than he could ever imagine. The raven was calling him home, but he had no idea what kind of nest awaited him. He was a foundling, a ghost, and the story of his life was about to begin, not with a birth, but with a terrible, whispered secret on a woman's skin. The encounter at the coffee shop had opened a Pandora's box in Elijah's life, and he couldn't close it. The image of the red-haired woman, the feather tattoo, and that look of terrified recognition on her face had become an obsession. He felt like a detective in his own life, a man hunting for a ghost he was biologically linked to. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to stop, to let it go, to accept the quiet, peaceful life he had. But the raven on his arm felt heavy, a constant weight pulling him forward. He had to know. He had to understand. His search was desperate and without a clear direction. He scoured social media, searching for anyone who might have a similar tattoo. He visited tattoo parlors, showing them a drawing of the bird, asking if they recognized the style, the artist. He was met with blank stares, polite shrugs, and sometimes a look of suspicion. The tattoo was old. The ink faded in a way that spoke of decades, not years. It was a dying art, a forgotten language. He felt like he was chasing a shadow, an echo from a time long past. But he couldn't stop. He was a man possessed, driven by a need so fundamental it superseded all reason. Days bled into weeks. The search consumed him. He took time off from work. His apartment became a mess of research papers and scribbled notes. His friends, concerned, tried to talk to him, but he was unreachable, a man adrift in a sea of his own making. The silence of his apartment was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the frantic hum of his mind, the constant replay of that fleeting moment with the red-haired woman. He began to see the bird everywhere, in the patterns of the city streets, the cracks in the pavement, the constellations in the night sky. The line between reality and obsession was blurring. Then came the second clue. It was an obituary, buried deep within the archives of a local newspaper. A small, nondescript column for a woman named Cassandra. She had died of a long illness, alone. But it was the picture that stopped Elijah's heart. It was the red-haired woman from the coffee shop. The woman with the feather tattoo. He stared at her face, a wave of despair washing over him. He had been so close. He had been so close, and she was gone. The cold fear in her eyes made sense now. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was running out of time. She knew something, and now that knowledge was buried with her. He felt the weight of his failure. All that effort, all that obsession had led him to a dead end. He almost gave up. He sat in his apartment, the silence mocking him, the raven on his arm a brand of his own futility. But something stopped him. The article mentioned a niece, a woman named Lena who lived in a small town a few hours away. A last, desperate thread of hope. It was a long shot. This woman was probably a stranger, a distant relative with no knowledge of her aunt's life, let alone her secrets. But Elijah was a drowning man, and this was the last life raft. He drove to the small town, the apathetic landscape of the American West unfolding around him. The town was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. He found Lena's house, a small, quaint bungalow with a porch swing and a garden of wilting flowers. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. A woman with dark, kind eyes and a weary expression answered. She wasn't red-haired. She was nothing like the woman from the coffee shop. He almost turned and left. But then he saw it. A faint, almost invisible mark on her neck, just below her ear. A small, stylized crow's foot. A piece of the puzzle, a different kind of bird. The moment he saw it, he knew. This woman was connected. The tattoos were a language, a series of symbols passed down. He had to be careful. He couldn't just blurt it out. He had to approach this with caution. He told her he was a friend of her aunt, an acquaintance from the coffee shop, that he had been trying to get in touch. He lied, but the lie felt right, a necessary evil. Lena, weary from grieving, invited him in. And as he stepped inside, he saw it. On the wall, among the family photographs, was a faded picture of a young woman with a long, intricate tattoo on her arm. It was a chain of birds, flying in an unbroken line. The first one was the raven. The last one was the tiny crow's foot on Lena's neck. And in the center, almost hidden, was the feather. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and the picture they were forming was more sinister and heartbreaking than he could ever have imagined. Lena looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a quiet sadness. She spoke of her Aunt Cassandra with a fondness that felt misplaced, given the haunted look Elijah had seen on the woman's face. "She was always a bit of a mystery," Lena said, her voice soft. "But she was kind, you know? She came to my rescue more times than I can count." Elijah listened, his mind racing, trying to find a way to ask about the tattoos without sounding insane. He knew, instinctively, that this wasn't just about a birth mother anymore. It was about a family, a lineage, a secret passed down through generations. He finally found his opening. He pointed to the picture on the wall, his voice carefully neutral. "That's a beautiful tattoo," he said. "The chain of birds. It looks very unique." Lena's expression shifted, a shadow crossing her face. "It is," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's a family thing. A curse, some would say." She glanced around the room as if expecting someone to be listening, her body language tense and guarded. "My great-grandmother started it. A tattoo for each child she lost. A bird for each child that flew away." The words hit Elijah with the force of a physical blow. Curse. A tattoo for each child she lost. His heart pounded, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He thought of the raven on his arm, a bird that flew away. He felt the blood rush to his head, a dizzying mix of horror and dawning understanding. He had to be a part of this story. He had to know the full truth. He confessed everything. He showed her the raven on his arm. He told her his story of the fire station, the blanket, the life he had lived without a past. He watched her face as his words sank in, and a flicker of recognition, a terrible, heartbreaking knowledge, flashed in her eyes. "The raven," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, I've heard stories about the raven. An old legend in our family. The lost son." She told him a story that felt more like a fairy tale than reality. It was a tale of a matriarch, a woman named Eleanor, who had a gift, a power she didn't understand. She could heal with her hands, but the cost was terrible. The life force she gave to others, she took from her own children. Her tattoos, the birds, were a way of tracking them, of marking the lives she had sacrificed for others. The first bird was the raven, for her son, the one she gave away to save her daughter from a terrible illness. Each bird after that was a child she lost, a life she traded for another. The story was a Gothic tapestry of pain and sacrifice. The women in her family, a line of healers, had inherited the curse. They carried the tattoos, a chain of sorrow on their skin, a silent testament to the lives they had lost. Lena's Aunt Cassandra, the feather tattoo. It was for a child she lost in a fire, a life she couldn't save. She had been a healer, too. But the curse was growing weaker, the power diluted with each generation. The tattoos were fading, becoming smaller, less defined. The chain was breaking. This was a story of a family, not just a mother. A lineage of women who had sacrificed their own for the good of others. A line of ghosts with ink on their skin. Elijah wasn't a mistake. He was a sacrifice. The raven on his arm was a marker, a symbol of a life given away to save another. The truth was more painful, more terrible than any abandonment he had imagined. His birth mother wasn't a monster. She was a victim. She was part of a chain of sorrow, a link in a lineage of women who had been forced to choose between the lives of their children. Elijah was not alone. He was part of a larger story, a tragic epic of a family bound by a terrible, beautiful curse. The raven on his arm was not a stain. It was a badge of honor, a mark of a sacrifice that had saved a life he had never known. The questions that had haunted him for decades were finally answered, but the answers were more heartbreaking than he could have ever conceived. He was the lost son, the raven, a ghost from a past filled with healing and death, sacrifice and sorrow. He was a part of a story that wasn't just his own. The truth had a weight that was almost unbearable. Elijah sat with Lena for hours, piecing together the broken fragments of his family history. He learned about Eleanor, the matriarch with the terrible gift, and the chain of women who followed her. He saw pictures of them, their faces beautiful and haunted, their arms and necks bearing the marks of their sacrifices. He saw the progression of the tattoos, from the large, intricate raven to the small, barely there crow's foot on Lena's neck. The curse was fading, but the sorrow remained. He was the living proof of that sorrow. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that held the most pain, was the story of his own mother. Lena pulled out an old, tattered journal, its pages filled with elegant, sloping handwriting. It was his birth mother's diary. Her name was Aurora. She had been a young woman, full of life, a brilliant artist with a wild, untamable spirit. But she was also a healer, the last in the line. She had given birth to a daughter, a beautiful, fragile baby girl who was born with a terrible heart defect. The doctors gave her only a few weeks to live. Aurora, bound by the curse, knew what she had to do. She had to sacrifice a life to save her daughter. She had to give away her son. The diary entries were a raw, agonizing account of her choice. She wrote about the pain, the terrible, wrenching agony of giving her son away. She wrote about the raven she had tattooed on his arm, a symbol of her love and a silent promise to never forget him. She wrote about the life she had given him, a life free from the curse, a life he deserved. But there was a twist. The curse, deluded and weak, had backfired. The life she gave him wasn't enough. Her daughter, his sister, had died anyway. A life for a life, a trade that failed. Aurora, her heart broken, had fled. She had left him on the fire station steps, a desperate act of love and protection. She had given him away to save him from the curse, only to realize the sacrifice had been for nothing. The final entry in the diary was a single sentence. I lost my son to save a daughter, and I lost them both. Aurora, a woman broken by a family curse, had lived a life of quiet despair, a ghost haunting the city streets, a woman who had given away everything for a promise that was never kept. The raven tattoo on his arm was her silent, agonizing scream, a mark of a love so profound it had broken her. The story was over, but the pain lingered. Elijah had found his mother, but he had lost her all over again. He had found his family, but their history was one of tragedy and sorrow. He had found the truth, and it was more terrible and beautiful than he could have ever imagined. He wasn't a foundling. He was a son, a brother, a link in a chain of brave, broken women. The raven on his arm wasn't a stain. It was his family crest, a symbol of a love that transcended time and a sacrifice that transcended life. He had followed a tattoo to find his mother, and he had found a legacy instead. And so, my friends, the story of Elijah comes to an end. It's a tale of secrets, of sacrifices, and of a man who found his family in the most unexpected of places. It's a reminder that we are all connected, and that sometimes the answers to our deepest questions are right there on our skin, waiting to be read. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. Your likes and shares help us reach more people and tell more incredible stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. We've got more tales of the strange and the beautiful, the haunting and the inspiring, waiting to be told.